I was born in Russia on January 2nd, 1920, but my parents emigrated to the United States, arriving on February 23rd, 1923. That means I have been an American by surroundings, and 5 years later, in September 1928, by citizenship, since I was 3 years old. I remember virtually nothing of my early years in Russia. I cannot speak Russian. I am not familiar, beyond what any intelligent American would be, with Russian culture. I am completely and entirely American by upbringing and feeling. But if I now try to discuss myself at the age of 3 and the years immediately beyond, which I do remember, I am going to have to make statements of the type that have always led some people to accuse me of being egotistical, or vain, or conceited. Or, if they are more dramatic, they say I have an ego the size of the Empire State Building. What can I do? The statements I make certainly seem to make it clear that I think highly of myself, but only for qualities that, in my opinion, deserve admiration. I also have many shortcomings and faults, and I admit them freely, but no one seems to notice that. In any case, when I say something that sounds vain, I assure you it is true, and I refuse to accept the accusation of vanity until somebody can prove that something I say that sounds vain is not true. So, I will take a deep breath and say that I was an infant prodigy. I don't know that there is a good definition of an infant prodigy. The Oxford English Dictionary describes it as a child of precocious genius. But how precocious? How much genius? You hear of children who can read at 2, who learn Latin at 4, who enter Harvard at the age of 12. I suppose those are undoubted infant prodigies, and in that case, I was not one. I suppose that if I had had a father who was an American intellectual, well off and lost in his study of the classics or of science, and if that father had discovered in me a likely candidate for prodigiousness, he might have driven me onward and gotten something like that out of me. I can only thank whatever chance has guided my life that this was not so. A force-fed child, driven relentlessly to the very top of his bent, might break under the strain. My father, however, was a small storekeeper, with no knowledge of American culture, with no time to guide me in any way, and no ability to do so even if he had the time. All he could do was to urge me to get good marks in school, and that was something I had every intention of doing anyhow. In other words, circumstances conspired to allow me to find my own happy level, which turned out to be sufficiently prodigious for all purposes, and yet kept the pressure at a sufficiently reasonable value to allow me to chug along rapidly with no feeling of strain whatever. It meant that I kept my prodigiousness for all my life, in one way or another. In fact, when asked if I was an infant prodigy, and I am asked this with disconcerting frequency, I have taken to answering, yes indeed, and I still am. I learned to read before I went to school, spurred on by my realization that my parents could not yet read English. I took to asking the older children on the block to teach me the alphabet and how each letter sounded. I then began to sound out all the words I could find on signs and elsewhere, and in that way, I learned to read with a minimum of outside help. When my father discovered that his preschool youngster could read and, moreover, when he found on questioning that the learning was on my own initiative, he was astounded. That may have been the first time he began to suspect that I was unusual. He kept that feeling all his life, though he never hesitated to criticize me for my many failings. The fact that he thought I was unusual, and made it clear that he did, gave me the first inkling that I was unusual. I imagine there must be many children who learn to read before going to school. I taught my younger sister to read before she went to school, for instance, but I taught her. No one taught me.